November 14, 1944, Camp Sterling, Ohio. Annalisa Schroeder pressed her fingertips against her temples, trying to will away the relentless pounding in her skull. The headache had started 3 days ago, shortly after she and 57 other German women had been transported to this prisoner of war facility outside Cleveland. Now it felt as though someone was driving iron spikes through her forehead with each heartbeat. She sat on the edge of her narrow cot in the converted warehouse that served as the women's barracks, her eyes squeezed shut against the pale November light filtering through the high windows. Around her, the other prisoners moved quietly through their morning routines, speaking in hushed German that somehow made her head throb even worse. 22 years old and 1,000 miles from home, Annalisa had never imagined her service to the Reich would end like this. She had joined the Women's Auxiliary Corps in 1943 as a communications specialist, proud to contribute to what she believed was her country's defense. Now she wore a faded gray uniform with the insignia torn away, sitting in an American prison camp with a headache that felt like it might split her skull open. The pain was so intense that she barely noticed when Corporal Thomas Benedetti approached her bunk during morning inspection. The young Italian-American supply sergeant had kind eyes that seemed out of place in a prison camp. He had been watching the German prisoners carefully since their arrival, noting who seemed ill or in distress. He spoke to her in simple English, his words meaningless to Annalisa's untrained ear. When she didn't respond, he made a gesture toward his own head and mimicked a pained expression. Then he held up one finger, indicating she should wait, and walked quickly toward the medical station at the far end of the building. Annalisa watched him go with confusion and a hint of fear. What did the Americans want with her? Were they going to interrogate her, punish her for not understanding their language? Her propaganda training had taught her to expect cruelty from American soldiers, though nothing in the past 3 days had confirmed those warnings. Corporal Benedetti returned moments later carrying a small white bottle and a tin cup of water. He shook 2 white pills into his palm and offered them to Annalisa with an encouraging nod. She stared at the pills with suspicion and uncertainty. What were these? Medicine? Poison? Some kind of American trick? The corporal seemed to sense her hesitation. He pointed to his own head again, then to the pills, then made a gesture as if the pain was floating away. His pantomime was almost comical, and despite her fear and discomfort, Annalise felt a flicker of something like trust. This young soldier was trying to help her, not hurt her. With trembling fingers, she took the pills and swallowed them with the water he offered. The corporal smiled, patted her shoulder gently, and continued his inspection rounds. Annalisa sat back on her cot, expecting nothing. 30 minutes later, she realized something extraordinary had happened. The crushing pain in her head had vanished completely. 3 days earlier, November 11, 1944, the transport trucks had rolled through the gates of Camp Sterling just after dawn. Annalise had pressed her face against the canvas covering, trying to glimpse what kind of prison awaited them. What she saw confused her more than it frightened her. The facility looked nothing like the grim military installation she had expected. It was a converted industrial complex, a former textile factory surrounded by hastily erected fencing and guard towers. The main building was brick, 3 stories tall, with rows of windows that suggested it had once housed machinery and workers rather than prisoners of war. The 58 German women climbed down from the trucks with a mixture of defiance and exhaustion etched on their faces. They had been captured in France and Belgium during the final chaotic months of the Wehrmacht's retreat, serving in roles that kept them close to, but not directly in combat. Radio operators, nurses, administrative clerks, translators, women who had believed they were supporting a defensive war, now facing the reality of capture by the enemy they had been taught to fear and hate. Annalisa stood in formation with the others, her back straight despite 3 days of travel with minimal food and rest. She was 22 years old, tall and lean, with dark blonde hair pulled back in the regulation style of the Women's Auxiliary Corps. Her hands clutched a small canvas bag containing everything she owned in the world: one change of clothes, a comb, a photograph of her family in Dresden, and a letter from her younger brother that she had read so many times the paper was beginning to tear along the folds. Beside her stood Hildegard Bachmann, a 26-year-old nurse from Nuremberg whose capable hands and calm demeanor had already made her a natural leader among the prisoners during their transport. Hilda's face showed no emotion as she surveyed their new surroundings, but Anneliese noticed how her friend's fingers tightened around the handle of her medical bag. On Anneliese's other side stood Irmgard Wagner, a 24-year-old translator from Munich whose knowledge of English would soon prove invaluable. Irmgard's eyes moved constantly, taking in every detail of the camp layout, the guard positions, the condition of the buildings. The American officer who processed their arrival was Lieutenant Ruth Kowalski, a stocky woman in her early 30s with steel-gray eyes and an efficient manner. She spoke to them through Irmgard, explaining the camp rules in a tone that was firm but not unkind. They would be housed in the east wing of the main building. They would maintain their own discipline and cleanliness. They would be assigned work duties. They would be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Anneliese listened to Irmgard's translation with growing confusion. This didn't sound like the brutal captivity she had been warned about. Where was the cruelty? Where was the hatred? Lieutenant Kowalski's voice held nothing but professional detachment as she outlined their daily schedule and expectations. The first 2 weeks at Camp Sterling passed in a fog of routine and silence. The German women moved through their assigned duties with mechanical precision, maintaining the military discipline that had been drilled into them during their service. They rose at 6 each morning, made their bunks with hospital corners, and stood for inspection before breakfast. They spoke only in German, only to each other, and only when necessary. To speak to their American captors felt like a betrayal of something they couldn't quite name anymore. Anneliese found herself assigned to the camp's administrative office, where her neat handwriting was put to use copying supply requisitions and duty rosters. She worked in silence beside 2 other German women, never making eye contact with the American staff who came and went throughout the day. When Corporal Benedetti delivered supplies to the office, she kept her gaze fixed on her paperwork, ignoring his friendly attempts at greeting. The wall between captor and captive felt necessary, protective, like the only thing standing between her and complete dissolution of identity. In the barracks each evening, the women gathered in small clusters on their bunks, speaking in whispers about home, about family, about the war they could no longer fight. Gertrude Hoffmann, at 31, the oldest among them, had taken on an unofficial leadership role. She had been a senior clerk in the Wehrmacht administration, accustomed to managing people and maintaining order. Now she enforced an unspoken code: maintain dignity, show no weakness, give the Americans no satisfaction of seeing them broken. The younger women followed her lead, standing straighter, speaking quieter, building walls around themselves made of pride and fear. Hildegard spent her days in the camp infirmary, where Lieutenant Kowalski had recognized her nursing training and put her to work organizing medical supplies. Hilda said little about what she observed there, but Anneliese noticed how her friend's expression grew more troubled each evening. Something about the American medical facility was disturbing Hilda in ways she wouldn't or couldn't articulate. When pressed, she would only shake her head and change the subject. Irmgard, with her language skills, had the most contact with their captors. She translated orders, explained procedures, and served as the bridge between the 2 groups. But even she maintained a careful distance, translating words without adding warmth or personality to the exchanges. Her English was fluent but deliberately cold, each sentence delivered with the emotional content of a weather report. The Americans seemed to respect this boundary, making no attempts to force friendliness or casual conversation. Private First Class James Park, a young Korean-American guard, walked his rounds with quiet efficiency, his face carefully neutral, as he observed the German prisoners. The morning after Corporal Benedetti gave Annalisa the white pills, she woke with a clarity she hadn't felt since before her capture. The headache that had plagued her for days was completely gone, vanished as if it had never existed. She sat up on her bunk, touching her temples experimentally, waiting for the familiar throb of pain to return. Nothing. Her head felt light, clear, normal. She stood and walked to the small mirror mounted on the wall near the wash basins, studying her own reflection with something approaching wonder. How had 2 small white pills accomplished what 3 days of suffering couldn't? During breakfast, she caught Corporal Benedetti's eye across the dining hall and offered him a small, hesitant nod of acknowledgement. His face broke into a warm smile, and he nodded back before continuing his rounds. That simple exchange felt momentous somehow, the first crack in the wall of silence the German women had built around themselves. Annalise returned to her table where Hilda and Irmgard sat, eating their morning rations of oatmeal and bread. She leaned close to them, speaking in rapid German that barely rose above a whisper. She told them about the headache, about the mysterious white pills, about the impossible speed with which her pain had disappeared. Hilda's eyebrows rose with professional interest. As a trained nurse, she demanded details. How large were the pills? What color? What taste? How long until the effect? Annalisa described everything she could remember, watching as Hilda's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something that looked almost like alarm. Word spread through the barracks that evening with the speed of wildfire in dry grass. The Americans had medicine that could erase pain in minutes. Medicine that worked like magic, like nothing the German women had ever encountered. Elfriede Klein, a 19-year-old radio operator who suffered from frequent stomach pains, asked Irmgard to inquire whether the Americans might share more of their miraculous medicine. Waltraud Fischer, a 28-year-old medical assistant who had worked alongside Hilda, complained of joint pain from the cold warehouse conditions. Even Gertrude Hoffmann, who had maintained the strictest adherence to the code of silence, admitted privately that she had been fighting off a persistent toothache for over a week. The following morning, when Lieutenant Kowalski made her rounds through the barracks, Irmgard approached her with careful formality. Speaking in her precise, emotionless English, she translated the women's requests for medicine. The lieutenant listened without interruption, her expression unreadable. When Irmgard finished, Lieutenant Kowalski simply nodded and said she would see what she could arrange. That afternoon, Corporal Benedetti appeared in the barracks carrying the now familiar white bottle. He moved from bunk to bunk, dispensing pills with the casual efficiency of someone handling ordinary supplies. 2 pills for headaches, 3 for more severe pain, 1 for minor discomfort. He offered them with the same friendly smile he gave everyone, as if this medicine was the most common thing in the world. To the German women watching this display, it seemed like witnessing a miracle worker distributing healing powers as carelessly as one might hand out bread. The ease with which he dispensed such powerful medicine only deepened their amazement and confusion. Hildegard Bachmann stood in the camp infirmary, her hands carefully organizing bandages into neat stacks on the supply shelf. Lieutenant Kowalski had entrusted her with inventory duties, a responsibility that both honored and troubled her. As a trained nurse from Nuremberg, Hilda understood medical supplies in a way most prisoners did not. What she was discovering in this American facility was shaking the foundation of everything she thought she knew about wartime medicine. The infirmary occupied a large room on the 2nd floor of the main building, with windows that let in generous amounts of natural light. The space was clean, well organized, and stocked with supplies that made Hilda's breath catch in her throat every time she opened a new cabinet. There were bottles of iodine, rolls of sterile gauze, glass syringes still in their paper wrapping, rubber gloves, surgical instruments that gleamed with recent sterilization. But it was the medicine cabinet that truly astounded her. row after row of bottles and containers, each labeled in English with names she struggled to decipher. The white pills that had cured Annalise's headache occupied just one small bottle among dozens of others. There were pills of different colors and sizes, liquids in amber bottles, powders in tins, ointments in tubes. The sheer abundance of it overwhelmed her professional understanding of wartime scarcity. Where had all this come from? How could the Americans have so much when Germany had so little? Hilda's experience as a nurse in Nuremberg had been defined by scarcity and substitution. By 1943, medical supplies in Germany had become precious commodities, rationed with brutal efficiency. She had learned to sterilize and reuse bandages until they fell apart. She had watched doctors perform surgeries without adequate anesthesia because morphine was reserved for soldiers at the front. She had treated patients with infections using remedies that belonged in her grandmother's kitchen rather than a modern hospital. And yet here, in an American prisoner of war camp, the medical supplies seemed limitless. Lieutenant Kowalski entered the infirmary carrying a clipboard, her expression businesslike as always. She spoke to Hilda in slow, clear English, pointing to different items and saying their names. The lieutenant seemed to have realized that teaching Hilda the English medical terminology would make their work together more efficient. Hilda repeated the words carefully, her German accent heavy, but her pronunciation improving with each session. Aspirin, bandage, antiseptic, thermometer. Each word felt like a small key unlocking a larger mystery. What disturbed Hilda most was not just the abundance of supplies, but their casual accessibility. In Germany, medical resources had been controlled with rigid hierarchy. Only senior doctors could authorize certain medications. Only designated personnel could access supply rooms. Everything was counted, recorded, justified. Here, Corporal Benedetti walked into the infirmary and filled his pockets with aspirin bottles, as casually as if he were taking apples from a bowl. No forms to sign, no authorization required, no anxious measuring of dwindling reserves. The Americans treated their medical supplies the way wealthy families treated bread, as something abundant enough to share without fear of running out. That night in the barracks, Hilda lay awake on her bunk, staring at the ceiling and trying to reconcile what she was witnessing. By the end of November, the white bottle had become a constant presence in the women's barracks. Corporal Benedetti no longer waited for requests. He simply made his rounds each morning and evening, asking through gestures and broken German English if anyone needed medicine. The women had stopped pretending they didn't. Elfrieda's stomach pains eased after 2 pills taken with breakfast. Waltraud's joint aches subsided enough that she could work without grimacing. Even Gertrude's persistent toothache, which had made eating a torture for weeks, vanished after 3 days of regular doses. The transformation was subtle, but unmistakable. The women began to gather around Corporal Benedetti during his medicine rounds, no longer maintaining the cold distance they had imposed on themselves. They still spoke little English, and he spoke no German, but communication happened anyway through smiles and nods, and the universal language of relief from suffering. Annalise found herself looking forward to these moments, watching how the young Italian-American soldier moved through the barracks with such genuine care for women who were supposed to be his enemies. But the medicine also raised uncomfortable questions that the women discussed in hushed conversations after lights out. If the Americans had such powerful medicine and shared it so freely with their prisoners, what did that say about the scarcity they had experienced in Germany? Irmgard, whose role as translator gave her more insight into American attitudes, reported that Lieutenant Kowalski seemed puzzled by their amazement at basic aspirin. The lieutenant had asked through Irmgard why the German military hadn't provided such simple pain relief to their auxiliary corps members. The question had no good answer. Hilda tried to explain to the others what she was observing in the infirmary, but words failed to capture the scale of the disparity. It wasn't just that the Americans had more supplies, It was that they seemed to operate from a completely different understanding of medical care. In Germany, Hilda had been taught that wartime required sacrifice, that civilians and auxiliary personnel must endure discomfort so that soldiers at the front could receive proper treatment. But here were the Americans, lavishing medical attention on enemy prisoners as if their comfort mattered as much as anyone else's. The white bottle became a symbol that extended far beyond simple pain relief. It represented a crack in the worldview the women had carried with them from Germany. If they had been lied to about something as basic as aspirin, what else had they been told that wasn't true? The question hung in the air of the barracks like smoke, impossible to ignore, but difficult to examine directly. To question the medicine was to question everything. And once you started questioning, where did you stop? Private Park observed these changes during his guard rounds, noting in his reports how the German prisoners had begun to soften, how the rigid military bearing was giving way to something more human. December brought bitter cold to Ohio, and with it, a new dynamic in Camp Sterling. The converted factory building, designed for industrial machinery rather than human habitation, proved difficult to heat adequately. The women huddled in their bunks under thin blankets, their breath visible in the morning air. Several developed persistent coughs. Others complained of stiffness in their joints that made morning routines painful. The white bottle made its rounds more frequently, but Corporal Benedetti seemed troubled by how often he was distributing pills for symptoms that medicine alone couldn't address. One morning, Annalise woke to find an extra blanket folded at the foot of her bunk. She sat up, confused, and looked around the barracks. Several other women were examining similar additions to their bedding, thick wool blankets in American military gray. No announcement had been made, no explanation given. The blankets had simply appeared during the night, like gifts from an anonymous benefactor. When Corporal Benedetti made his morning rounds, Irmgard asked him about the blankets. He smiled and shrugged, saying something in English that included the word requisitioned and what sounded like from storage. The message was clear enough. Someone had decided the German prisoners needed better protection from the cold and had made it happen. The small acts of consideration continued to accumulate. When Elfrida's cough persisted despite aspirin, Lieutenant Kowalski brought her a bottle of cough syrup and a tin of honey, explaining through Irmgard that the honey should be mixed with hot water before bed. When Waltraud mentioned that the thin prison shoes provided little protection from the cold concrete floors, Private Park appeared 2 days later with a box of thick wool socks, enough for all 58 women. The gifts were never presented as charity or kindness, always as simple problem-solving, as if caring for prisoners was just another duty to be performed efficiently. But perhaps the most significant gesture came from an unexpected source. Gertrude Hoffmann, whose toothache had finally subsided thanks to regular aspirin, had been watching the Americans with increasing confusion. She had spent her entire adult life in military administration, understanding hierarchy and protocol. What the Americans were doing made no sense within that framework. They were guards, the women were prisoners. Yet the Americans kept blurring those lines with small acts that felt more like hospitality than supervision. One evening, Gertrude approached Corporal Benedetti during his rounds and spoke to him in halting English she had been learning from Irmgard. "Thank you," she said carefully, gesturing to encompass the blankets, the medicine, the socks. "You are kind. We do not expect." The corporal's face showed surprise, then something softer. "Your people," he replied simply. "People get cold, people get sick. Doesn't matter what uniform you wore." Irmgard translated his words, and they rippled through the nearby bunks like a stone, dropped in still water. December 24, 1944, arrived with fresh snow blanketing Camp Sterling in white silence. The German women woke to find that the Americans had decorated the barracks dining hall with pine branches and paper chains clearly made by hand. A small evergreen tree stood in the corner, its branches adorned with strings of popcorn and cut paper stars. The sight of these modest decorations hit the women with unexpected force. This was their first Christmas away from home, their first holiday as prisoners, their first celebration knowing that the world they had left behind in Germany might not exist anymore. Lieutenant Kowalski had organized the decorations with help from several guards who volunteered their off-duty hours. She understood that homesickness and depression were as dangerous to her prisoners' health as any physical ailment. The Christmas celebration was calculated to boost morale, but it was also genuine. Many of the American staff were far from their own families, missing their own holiday traditions. The shared displacement created an unexpected common ground. That evening, the women gathered in the dining hall for a special meal. The food was simple but abundant: roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. To women who had grown accustomed to military rations and wartime scarcity, the meal felt extravagant. Anneliese ate slowly, savoring each bite while trying not to think about what her family in Dresden might be eating tonight, if they were eating at all. The bomber raids on German cities had intensified in recent months. She had no way of knowing if her parents and brother were even still alive. After dinner, Corporal Benedetti produced a harmonica and began playing Christmas carols. The American staff sang along in English, their voices filling the hall with melodies that transcended language. Silent Night was recognizable even across the barrier of different words. Some of the German women began humming along, then quietly singing the German lyrics. Stille Nacht, Heilige Nacht. The two languages wove together in unexpected harmony. It was during this moment of shared music that Anneliese felt something inside her break open. She had been holding herself together through discipline and denial, refusing to acknowledge the fear and grief that threatened to overwhelm her. But sitting in this decorated hall, listening to German and American voices blend together, singing about peace on earth, she could no longer maintain the walls she had built. Tears began streaming down her face, and she made no attempt to hide them. She was not alone. Around the room, other women were crying quietly, their faces reflecting the same mixture of homesickness, loss, and confusion. They were crying for families they might never see again, for a Germany that had betrayed them, for the impossible situation of finding kindness in captivity while their country lay in ruins. Hildegard sat beside Anneliese and took her hand, offering silent comfort. Across the table, Irmgard wiped her own eyes with trembling fingers. When the singing ended, Anneliese stood up slowly. She had been thinking about the white pills for weeks, about all the small kindnesses that made no sense according to everything she had been taught. She needed to understand. Through Irmgard's translation, she addressed Lieutenant Kowalski directly. "The medicine you give us," she said haltingly. "The white pills. What are they? What is this? Magic?" The lieutenant's expression softened with understanding. "Not magic," she replied gently. "Just aspirin, simple medicine that anyone can have." The word aspirin meant nothing to most of the German women, but to Hildegard it landed like a physical blow. She sat very still at the dining table, her mind racing through implications she wasn't ready to confront. Aspirin, she knew that word. She had learned about acetyl salicylic acid during her nursing training in Nuremberg years ago, back when medical textbooks still discussed treatments that weren't available anymore. Aspirin was supposed to be a common analgesic, something ordinary and accessible. So why had it seemed like magic to them? Lieutenant Kowalski, seeing Hilda's reaction, gestured for her to follow to the infirmary. The two women walked through the quiet hallways while the Christmas celebration continued in the dining hall behind them. Once in the medical room, the lieutenant opened the familiar medicine cabinet and pulled out the white bottle. She handed it to Hilda, pointing to the label. The English words were printed clearly: Aspirin tablets, 5 grains each, for relief of minor aches and pains. Instructions for dosage followed in matter-of-fact medical language. Hilda held the bottle with shaking hands, reading and rereading the label as if it might change meaning if she looked long enough. 5-grain tablets, standard dosage, relief of minor aches and pains. This was basic medicine, the kind that should have been available in every German field hospital, every military infirmary, every auxiliary course medical station. But it hadn't been. Not in her experience. Not for the last 2 years of her service at minimum. Lieutenant Kowalski spoke slowly, and though Hilda's English was limited, she understood enough. The lieutenant was asking when Hilda had last seen aspirin in Germany. The question forced Hilda to confront memories she had been avoiding. When had simple pain relief become a luxury? When had she stopped expecting to have access to basic analgesics? She thought back through the chronology of her nursing service. 1942, supplies had been tight but adequate. 1943, shortages became routine. By early 1944, she was treating patients with willow bark tea and cold compresses because pharmaceutical pain relievers had become unavailable for civilian and auxiliary medical use. But she had accepted this as normal wartime sacrifice. Everyone had told her it was necessary, that the soldiers at the front needed the medicine more than administrative personnel, and civilians did. She had believed them. She had watched women suffer through headaches and menstrual cramps and minor injuries without complaint because complaining seemed unpatriotic, seemed weak. And all along she now realized their enemies had so much aspirin they could give it away to prisoners without a second thought. The lieutenant opened another cabinet, revealing rows of other medicines. She began naming them in English, and Hilda recognized enough of the Latin-based medical terminology to understand. Antibiotics, antiseptics, analgesics, anti-inflammatory drugs, vitamins. The cabinet held more pharmaceutical supplies than Hilda had seen in the entire last year of her service in Germany. And this was just for a small prisoner of war camp housing fewer than 60 women. Hilda felt something fundamental shifting inside her understanding of the world. She had been trained as a healer, someone who alleviated suffering and promoted health. But her service to Germany had required her to accept suffering as inevitable, to ration care, to decide who deserved treatment and who must simply endure. The revelation about aspirin spread through the barracks on Christmas night like a contagion of understanding. What had seemed miraculous was revealed to be ordinary. What had seemed like generous charity was simply normal medical care. The implications rippled outward in concentric circles of realization, touching every aspect of how the women understood their captivity and their previous service. If something as basic as pain relief had been kept from them, what else had been withheld? What other sacrifices had been unnecessary? Annalisa lay awake on her bunk long after lights out, listening to the whispered conversations echoing through the darkness. The women were comparing notes, sharing memories of times they had suffered needlessly. Elfrida remembered working through brutal stomach cramps during her radio shifts, believing her discomfort was a small price for the war effort. Waltraud recalled watching women in her medical unit treat injuries with inadequate supplies, never questioning why basic medicines weren't available. Every story added another crack to the foundation of their previous understanding. But it wasn't just the medicine that was causing this reckoning. Over the past weeks, the women had been observing other disparities that they had initially dismissed as uniquely American excess. The food in the camp mess hall, while simple, appeared in quantities that seemed almost wasteful by German standards. Fresh bread every day, coffee that wasn't made from acorns or chicory, meat several times a week, apples and oranges as casual accompaniments to meals rather than precious luxuries. Irmgard had been keeping a mental catalog of these observations through her role as translator. She had access to American administrative areas that other prisoners never saw. She had watched supply deliveries arrive with clockwork regularity. She had seen the casual way American staff requested materials and equipment without the anxious hoarding mentality that had characterized German military operations in her experience. Everything from soap to toilet paper to writing materials seemed abundant to the point of carelessness. The German women had been taught that scarcity was the natural condition of wartime, that deprivation built character and demonstrated commitment to the cause. They had been told that Americans were soft and materialistic, weakened by their abundance, and unable to make the hard sacrifices that war required. But what if abundance wasn't weakness? What if having enough medicine and food and supplies made soldiers and support personnel more effective rather than less? What if unnecessary suffering wasn't noble, but simply unnecessary? Gertrude Hoffmann, lying in her bunk and thinking about her toothache that had finally ended after years of intermittent agony, felt anger beginning to replace her confusion. She was 31 years old, had given 8 years of her life to military service, had endured countless indignities and hardships in the name of duty. And for what? So that basic medical care could be rationed away from her while her superiors told her it was for the greater good? The anger felt dangerous, disloyal, but also cleansing in a way she hadn't expected. In the infirmary, Hilda sat, alone with Lieutenant Kowalski's medical references, struggling through English texts about standard field medicine protocols. The books described aspirin as essential basic supply for any military medical operation. February 1945 brought two kinds of bitter cold to Camp Sterling. The first was meteorological, a brutal winter that kept the women huddled near the barracks' heating stoves, even with their additional blankets. The second was informational, arriving in the form of American newspapers that Irmgard had been given permission to read and translate for the other prisoners. The news from Germany was growing darker with each passing week, and not just because of military defeats. Lieutenant Kowalski had made the deliberate decision to allow the German prisoners access to news, believing they had a right to know what was happening in their homeland. She understood this information might be painful, but she also believed that truth, however harsh, was preferable to the uncertainty that bred wild speculation and false hope. So each week, Irmgard received a stack of newspapers and spent hours translating the most significant articles for her fellow prisoners. The military news was grim but expected. Allied forces were advancing on all fronts. German cities were being bombed with increasing intensity. The outcome of the war was no longer in question, only its timeline and final cost. The women absorbed these reports with resignation and grief. Each city name a reminder of homes and families they might never see again. Annalisa read about bombing raids on Dresden with hands that shook so badly she could barely hold the newspaper. But it was the other news that truly shattered them. Starting in late January and continuing through February, American newspapers began publishing accounts of what Allied forces were discovering as they advanced into German territory. The first reports seemed impossible, too horrible to believe. Camps where civilians had been imprisoned and systematically murdered, industrial facilities designed for mass killing, evidence of atrocities on a scale that defied comprehension. The articles included photographs, grainy but undeniable, showing scenes that would haunt the women for the rest of their lives. Irmgard sat in the barracks common area with newspapers spread before her on a table, trying to find words in German that could adequately translate what she was reading in English. The other women gathered around her, their faces reflecting disbelief that slowly gave way to horror as the full scope of the revelations became clear. These weren't just wartime atrocities of the kind that occurred in any conflict. These were organized programs of extermination carried out with bureaucratic efficiency in the same country where they had lived and worked and believed they were serving a defensive cause. Annalisa felt physically ill as she listened to Irmgard's translation. The names of the camps meant nothing to her. Buchenwald, Dachau, Bergen-Belsen. She had never heard of these places, had no knowledge they existed, but the articles claimed these camps had been operating for years, some since before the war even began. How was that possible? How could such things happen in Germany without ordinary people knowing? Or had people known and simply chosen not to see? Hildegard's nursing training made the medical details in the reports especially horrifying to her. Experiments conducted on prisoners without anesthesia, deliberate infection with diseases to study their progression, systematic starvation documented with clinical precision, the perversion of medical science into instruments of torture and death made her question everything she had learned about the healing profession in Germany. Had her teachers known about these things? Had the medical establishment been complicit? The day after reading the most devastating newspaper reports, Hildegard made a decision that would change everything for the German women at Camp Sterling. She approached Lieutenant Kowalski during morning rounds and made an unusual request through Irmgard's translation. She wanted to give the other prisoners a tour of the infirmary's medical supplies. She wanted them to see with their own eyes what abundance actually looked like, to understand the full scope of what had been kept from them during their service to the Reich. Lieutenant Kowalski studied Hilda's face for a long moment before agreeing. She understood what the German nurse was attempting to do, the connection she was trying to help her fellow prisoners make between the aspirin revelation and the larger deceptions they were now confronting through newspaper reports. That afternoon, small groups of German women filed through the infirmary in carefully supervised visits, their eyes widening as Hilda opened cabinet after cabinet to reveal the contents. The first cabinet held basic supplies, bandages of various sizes, all sterile and individually wrapped, adhesive tape, cotton swabs, gauze pads, rubber gloves still in their paper packaging, nothing exotic or rare, just standard medical materials that any facility should have. But to women who had served in German auxiliary units where such supplies were constantly rationed and reused, the sight of fresh, unused material sitting in abundant stock was revelatory. The second cabinet contained antiseptics and disinfectants, bottles of iodine, hydrogen peroxide, rubbing alcohol, all in quantities that suggested regular use rather than careful hoarding. Hilda explained in German that these supplies were restocked weekly, that the Americans simply ordered more when levels ran low. There was no anxiety about running out, no complex rationing system, no forms to fill out justifying usage. Medical supplies were treated as necessary tools to be kept in adequate supply, not precious resources to be distributed according to hierarchy and priority. The third cabinet was the one that caused the strongest reactions. Medications, row after row of bottles and containers, each labeled with names the women were learning to recognize. The aspirin bottle that had started everything sat among dozens of other remedies, pain relievers of various strengths, anti-inflammatory medications, antibiotics, vitamins, cough suppressants, digestive aids, ointments for skin conditions, eye drops, ear drops. The sheer variety was overwhelming. Elfrida stood before the medicine cabinet with tears streaming down her face, remembering the stomach pains she had endured for months during her radio service in France. Simple digestive medication could have relieved her suffering, but she had been told no such medicine was available for auxiliary personnel. Waltraud stared at the bottles of anti-inflammatory drugs, thinking about women she had worked with who had developed chronic joint problems from cold, damp conditions without access to basic treatment. Gertrude examined the dental supplies, including medication specifically for toothaches, and felt her earlier anger solidify into something harder and more permanent. But it was Anneliese who asked the question that had been forming in all their minds. She spoke quietly in German, her voice barely above a whisper, and Irmgard translated for Lieutenant Kowalski. Why did they tell us there was nothing? Why did they let us suffer when medicine like this existed? The lieutenant's response was honest and brutal. Because your leaders didn't value you enough to provide it. Because they spent resources on weapons instead of on caring for their people. That evening, Anneliese sat on her bunk with a precious sheet of paper and a pencil she had borrowed from the administrative office. She wanted to write to her family in Dresden, to tell them about everything she was learning and experiencing at Camp Sterling. But as she tried to form the words, she realized the impossibility of what she was attempting. How could she explain to her parents that the enemy was treating her with more care than her own country had? How could she tell her younger brother that the Americans she had been taught to fear and hate were the ones who had shown her what basic human dignity looked like? She began the letter 3 times, crossing out each attempt. "Dear Mama and Papa, I am well and the Americans are kind," seemed like a betrayal. "Dear family, I have learned that we were deceived about many things," sounded like treason. "Dear brother, the medicine here is better than anything we had in Germany," felt like disloyalty to everyone still suffering at home. Every honest sentence she could compose felt dangerous in ways that went beyond simple censorship concerns. She was trying to articulate a transformation that had no safe vocabulary. Around the barracks, other women were engaged in the same struggle. Irmgard had filled 4 pages with cramped German handwriting, then torn them all up and started over. How could she explain to her mother in Munich that she was grateful to be a prisoner? Hildegard had written a letter to her former nursing supervisor in Nuremberg, trying to describe the medical supplies she had seen, but the words on paper looked like wild exaggeration or propaganda lies. No one in Germany would believe that American prison camps had more medicine than German hospitals. Elfrieda's letter to her sister consisted of a single paragraph that said nothing of substance. "I am healthy and safe. The winter here is cold, but we have warm blankets. I hope you are well. I think of you every day." She stared at the inadequate words and wondered what she was protecting by not telling the truth. Was she trying to spare her sister pain, or was she afraid of admitting how completely her worldview had changed? The censorship process meant that all letters would be read by American officers before being sent. But that wasn't what stopped the women from writing honestly. It was the knowledge that their families in Germany would not be able to understand or accept what they needed to say. The gap between their current experience and their family's likely reality had grown too wide to bridge with words on paper. Their loved ones were living through bombing raids and food shortages and the collapse of everything familiar. How could the women in Camp Sterling explain that they had found abundance and kindness in captivity? Waltraud finally gave up on writing entirely. She folded her blank paper carefully and tucked it away for future use. Some truths, she decided, could only be shared in person if she ever made it home. Some transformations were too profound to capture in letters that would be read by censors and delivered to people living in a completely different reality. April 1945 arrived with the slow melting of winter snow and the rapid collapse of German military resistance. The women at Camp Sterling followed the news through Irmgard's translations with a mixture of relief and dread. Each Allied victory brought them closer to the end of the war, but also closer to the moment when they would have to decide what came next. The question of repatriation, once theoretical and distant, was becoming immediate and unavoidable. Lieutenant Kowalski began preparing the women for the transition, explaining through Irmgard that once Germany surrendered, processes would begin to return prisoners of war to their homeland. The Geneva Convention required it. International law demanded it. But as the lieutenant outlined the procedures and timelines, she noticed something unexpected in the prisoners' reactions. Instead of relief or excitement at the prospect of going home, many of the women looked uncertain, even afraid. Anneliese had been thinking about Dresden constantly since reading about the bombing raids that had devastated the city in February. Estimates suggested tens of thousands dead, the historic city center reduced to rubble. She had received no word from her family since before her capture. For all she knew, her parents and brother were among the casualties. The thought of returning to Dresden to find ruins and graves instead of home was almost unbearable. But staying in America as a former enemy national seemed equally impossible. The women had changed during their months at Camp Sterling in ways that went far beyond learning English or developing friendships with their former enemies. They had been forced to confront truths about the regime they had served, about the lies they had believed, about the unnecessary suffering they had endured in the name of duty and sacrifice. They had discovered that their enemies were capable of kindness, and their own leaders had been capable of monstrous deception. These realizations had fundamentally altered their sense of identity and belonging. Hildegard spoke for many of them during an evening gathering in the barracks. "What Germany are we returning to?" she asked the assembled women. "The physical Germany of bombed cities and occupation zones, or the idea of Germany we thought we were serving? Because that Germany never existed. We were serving a lie." Her words hung in the cold spring air, articulating what many had been thinking but hadn't dared to say aloud. Gertrude, always practical, raised different concerns. "Even if our families survived, what will they think of us? We were captured. We spent months with Americans. We learned their language, accepted their medicine, ate their food. Some in Germany will see us as collaborators or traitors." The fear of being caught between two worlds, belonging fully to neither, resonated through the group. They were no longer the women who had been captured 6 months earlier. But they weren't American either. They existed in a liminal space that the coming peace threatened to eliminate. Irmgard had been corresponding with American officials as part of her translation duties, and she shared information that added another layer of complexity. May 8, 1945. Victory in Europe Day. The announcement came through Camp Sterling's radio system in the early afternoon, delivered in the measured tones of an official broadcaster. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. In towns and cities across America, celebrations erupted with church bells ringing and crowds filling the streets. At Camp Sterling, the atmosphere was more subdued, marked by complicated emotions that resisted simple categorization. The German women gathered in the dining hall to hear Lieutenant Kowalski's official announcement about repatriation procedures. The officer stood before them with documents from the War Department, her expression professional but not unkind. She explained that transportation would be arranged within the coming weeks. They would be processed through displaced persons camps in Europe before being released to return to their homes or what remained of them. The procedures were standard, the timeline clear, the expectations straightforward. What happened next was something Lieutenant Kowalski had not anticipated, despite her months of observing these prisoners. Annalisa stood up slowly, her hands trembling, but her voice steady. She spoke in English that had improved dramatically over the past months, clear enough to be understood without Irmgard's translation. "Lieutenant Kowalski, may I speak for some of us?" Permission was granted. Annalisa looked around at her fellow prisoners before continuing. "We have been talking among ourselves for many weeks. Some of us do not wish to return to Germany immediately." The words created a stunned silence in the hall. American guards exchanged confused glances. Even some of the German women looked surprised, though others nodded in quiet agreement. Hildegard stood next, followed by Irmgard, Elfrida, and 7 other women. They formed a distinct group within the larger assembly, their decision clearly made after long deliberation. Hildegard spoke in careful English. "Germany is not our home anymore. The Germany we served, we discovered, was not the Germany we believed in." Lieutenant Kowalski found herself momentarily speechless. In her entire military career, she had never encountered prisoners of war requesting to remain in captivity rather than accept freedom. She asked for clarification, and what followed was an outpouring of emotion that revealed the depth of transformation these women had undergone over 6 months. They had tried to locate their families through the International Red Cross with limited success. Of the 11 women who wished to stay, only 2 had received news from home, and that news had been devastating. Annalise explained that her entire family in Dresden was presumed dead, killed in the February bombing raids. Returning to a city of ruins and mass graves held no appeal when she had found something unexpected here. "In this camp," she said, her voice breaking slightly, "we learned what it means to be treated with dignity, even as enemies. We have seen kindness where we expected cruelty. We have been given medicine for headaches as if our pain mattered. Small things, but they showed us we were valued as human beings." The implications were staggering. Legally, they were still enemy prisoners of war subject to Geneva Convention protocols for repatriation. But their emotional appeal touched something deeper than legal procedures. The days following the unprecedented request became a period of intense deliberation and soul-searching throughout Camp Sterling. Lieutenant Kowalski had sent urgent communications to her superiors in Washington, describing the situation and requesting guidance. The response took nearly a week to arrive, during which the camp existed in a strange state of suspended animation. The women who had requested to stay continued their daily routines with renewed purpose, as if proving their worthiness through diligence and cooperation. The decision from Washington was characteristically bureaucratic, but unexpectedly flexible. The War Department would not prevent the immediate repatriation of any prisoner who wished to return. However, given the unusual circumstances and the ongoing chaos in occupied Germany, those who wished to remain could be reclassified as displaced persons and processed for potential immigration status. This meant they would no longer be prisoners of war, but they also would no longer be guaranteed housing and support at the camp. They would need sponsors, employment, and communities willing to accept former enemy nationals. The announcement divided the women more sharply than anything had before. Of the 11 who had initially requested to stay, 3 reconsidered when they understood the full implications. The uncertainty was too great, the challenges too daunting. They would return to Germany and face whatever awaited them there with courage and determination. But 8 women, led by Anneliese, Hildegard, and Irmgard, chose to accept the challenge of starting completely new lives in America. Their decision required a leap of faith that felt both terrifying and necessary. For those choosing repatriation, the decision was equally valid and equally difficult. Gertrude Hoffmann, despite her anger about the medical supplies and her growing understanding of how she had been deceived, felt a powerful obligation to return. "Germany will need people who understand what we've learned here," she told the others. "People who can help rebuild not just buildings, but values and systems. Running away to America feels like abandoning that responsibility." 47 women nodded in agreement with her reasoning, but perhaps the most remarkable development was the transformation in how the women who were leaving viewed their return. Waltraud Fischer stood before the assembled prisoners and American staff to make an announcement that surprised everyone. "Those of us who are going back," she said through Irmgard's translation, "we are not returning as defeated prisoners. We are returning as ambassadors of the reconciliation we have experienced here. We want to carry back the lessons we have learned about forgiveness and cooperation and the possibility of former enemies becoming friends." The women who had chosen repatriation began requesting items to take with them that would serve as proof of their experiences. Elfrida asked Corporal Benedetti for an empty aspirin bottle, which he provided along with a full one for her journey. Waltraud requested a photograph of the American staff. Gertrude asked for a letter from Lieutenant Kowalski describing their time at Camp Sterling. These small tokens became precious cargo, evidence of transformation that words alone could not convey. June 20th, 1945, arrived with morning sunshine that seemed inappropriate for the occasion. The day marked the final repatriation of German prisoners from Camp Sterling, a moment that should have been purely administrative, but had evolved into something far more significant. The 47 women who had chosen to return to Germany stood in formation one last time, but their military bearing had softened over the months into something more human and less rigid. They carried with them carefully packed belongings that included items never intended for prisoner transport. Letters from American soldiers expressing respect and friendship, Photographs from their time at the camp showing Germans and Americans working side by side. Small gifts that had been given to them by guards and staff who had become something approaching friends. Most importantly, they carried bottles of aspirin, both empty and full, symbols of the small truth that had opened their eyes to larger deceptions. Lieutenant Kowalski addressed the departing women with words she had labored over for days, wanting to strike the right balance between official protocol and genuine emotion. "You came here as our enemies," she told them, "but you leave as something we never expected, as friends. I hope you will remember that Americans can show mercy without forgetting justice, and that redemption is possible even in the darkest times." Her voice remained steady, professional, but there was warmth in her eyes that belied the formal tone. Annalisa, speaking for those who were staying, stood to respond. Her English had become fluent and confident over the months of practice and study. "Lieutenant Kowalski, we came here believing we knew what America was. We learned that we knew nothing. We thought Americans were our enemies. We discovered that the only real enemy was our own ignorance and the lies we had been told. Some of us are staying to build new lives here. Others are returning to help rebuild Germany, but all of us are changed by what we learned in this place." The women who were staying watched their friends board the transport vehicles that would take them to the port in Boston, then to ships bound for Europe. Tears were shed on both sides, but they were tears of hope rather than despair. Both groups were embarking on journeys toward unknown futures, journeys they had chosen rather than simply endured. The act of choosing, after months of having no control over their circumstances, felt powerful and transformative in itself. Gertrude was the last to board, pausing at the truck's entrance to look back at the camp that had been her prison, and paradoxically, her liberation. She caught Hildegard's eye across the compound and raised her hand in farewell. The gesture was returned, a moment of understanding passing between women who had traveled very different paths to reach the same realization about the importance of truth and dignity. 25 years later, on a bright autumn afternoon in 1970, Annalisa Schroeder Henderson stood before a gathering at a German-American Friendship Society in Cleveland, Ohio. She was 47 years old now, an American citizen with grown children and a successful career as a medical translator. Her accent still carried traces of her Dresden childhood, but her English was flawless and her American identity complete. In her hands, she held a small glass bottle, its label faded but still readable. Aspirin tablets, 5 grains each. The audience listened with rapt attention as she told the story of how 2 white pills had changed her life and the lives of 11 other German women prisoners. She spoke about the headache that wouldn't end, about Corporal Benedetti's casual kindness, about the moment she realized that what seemed like magic was simply ordinary medicine that should have been available all along. The Aspirin bottle had become her most treasured possession, a tangible reminder of the day her understanding of the world began to shift. She spoke about Hildegard, who had become Dr. Hildegard Bachmann and now ran a community health clinic in nearby Akron. Hilda had dedicated her life to ensuring that basic medical care was accessible to everyone regardless of their ability to pay or their background. The medicine cabinet at Camp Sterling had taught her that abundance was possible, that scarcity was often a choice rather than a necessity. Irmgard had become a professor of comparative literature at a small college, teaching students about the importance of language and communication in bridging cultural divides. But Annalisa also spoke about those who had returned to Germany. Gertrude Hoffmann had become a leader in rebuilding efforts in her hometown, known for her insistence on transparency and accountability in local government. Waltraud Fischer had worked with international relief organizations, helping to distribute medical supplies to war-torn regions and ensuring that basic medicines reached those who needed them most. Elfriede Klein had become a teacher, educating a new generation of Germans about the importance of questioning authority and seeking truth. The aspirin bottle, Annalise explained, had come to symbolize something far larger than simple pain relief. It represented the moment when small acts of kindness revealed large truths about human dignity and worth. It stood for the idea that caring for people's basic needs, even your enemy's needs, was not weakness, but strength. It demonstrated that transformation was possible when societies chose compassion over cruelty, abundance over artificial scarcity, truth over comfortable lies. She concluded her speech by holding up the bottle so everyone in the audience could see it clearly. "This bottle taught me that home is not just where you come from," she said. "It is where you choose to build a life that honors the best in human nature rather than the worst." The Americans gave us aspirin for headaches, but what they really gave us was the revelation that we deserved to have our pain taken seriously, that our suffering mattered, that we were human beings worthy of basic care and dignity. That simple truth changed everything.